Hello, welcome back to Huntertuned. Today I'm going to kind of go over some basics of Hondata Smanager. This is the software that you use to tune your Hondata S300. I recently got a S300 for my EK hatchback and have a lot of questions on S300. So I'm just going to go over some basics in this video and kind of go over some of just the small stuff, maybe how to build a base map and whatnot. So to start off, this is the Hondata Smanager software. When you pull it up, you can download this right from Hondata's website. This is just the Hondata Smanager 2.6.6 version, and when you click it open, I just have it on my desktop here, and there we go. Pull it up, and this is what the Smanager software looks like when you first pull it up. You can open the parameters, the tables, everything here. I'm going to minimize this quick so you guys can see what's going on. Alright, so you have parameters. This is the tables section. This is sensors over here. So when you're data logging, you can check out your sensors and whatnot. I'm not going to go over a lot of that stuff quite yet. I'm just going to kind of go over some basics, like I said. Alright, and to start with Hondata, when you first open it up, you're not going to have anything populated. So like I have the tables opened right now, and they are blank. Obviously, there is nothing going on here. So this is just how it comes until you open up a calibration. Now, when you open up a calibration in Hondata, you can either go to File, New, or you can just hit New Calibration right here. And it'll give you a drop-down box with a bunch of different kind of base maps to start from. I usually always use the stock ITR one, which is the first one here, and click that to open it. And then you have your tables all highlighted here. This is the 3D table, and then you can switch this over to 2D if you want to check out some more stuff there. And then you have 4 different indicators here, 4 different maps up on the top left. And the number 1 lightning bolt is going to be your low cam ignition map. This ignition map is going to be for non-VTEC operation. So this is where the car is going to be running on this table here before it crosses over into VTEC. Or if it's a non-VTEC engine, it's going to run on this ignition map non-stop. To tune the low cam ignition map, you need to be on the number 1 lightning bolt here, and to tune the high cam ignition map, you have to switch over to the number 2 lightning bolt, which this table here is for the VTEC operation. So wherever you have VTEC set, so if you have it set at like 5,000 RPM, VTEC will cross over and it'll switch from the number 1 map to the number 2 map, and then you'll have to tune the VTEC side of the map. Same thing goes for fuel over here. This is the number 1 low speed fuel table. This is for non-VTEC operation. And then the number 2 is for the VTEC operation here. So that's pretty much the basics of the fuel table. Like I said, you can tune 2D or 3D maps here as well. So yeah, pretty simple stuff here. The only thing that's different with Hondata compared to Chrome is the vacuum here on the top rows. You can see it starts at negative 3.8 here. And then it goes like 8, 12.3, 15, 19.2, and it goes like backwards. I don't know why that is. If anybody knows, you can let me know. But normally the table would go 29 over where 3 is and 3 over where 29 is. That's just kind of... I don't know what the bug is there with Hondata, but that's just how it is. But this is where the low vacuum or high vacuum. This is where high vacuum is, and this is where low vacuum is. So like wide open is going to be over here still, and idling and cruising around is still going to be over in this region here. Now this feature here is just to increase your selection. So if if you're tuning the idle part of the table, you can highlight here and you can increase or decrease your fuel with these 2 buttons here, or you can right click the selected portion and you can hit adjust and change it that way, and you can go throughout your fuel map and tune it. Same thing with ignition, you can do the same thing, highlight it, right click, etc. Now there is a few different tables that you can use. You can use the normal fuel table and ignition tables like you see here, or you can switch over to see like your recorded, so when you data log or when you record. So normally if you were hooked up to the ECU, these would be highlighted right here, and you could click data log, which is this lightning bolt here, and you can start a data log. And if you have your wideband plugged in, this will actually show all the corrections on the map, so you can go drive around and it'll populate all these cells saying, hey, you need to pull 10% in this column, you need to pull 3% in this column, 5% here, etc., etc. So that's pretty cool that you can do that and show your kind of data logged lambda. That's what pretty much these two tables are. The first one here is just going to show what the air fuel was at what cell, and then you can see in this table what the corrected, suggested corrected amount would be. And this is your target lambda, so like if you have this all set at 14.7 and then you go back to your corrected table and these are all 13.7, you're going to have to probably pull 10% out of the region in order to achieve the target lambda, which is on this table here. Hopefully this stuff makes sense. I don't want to go over anybody's head, but just kind of show kind of basics of Hondata here. So those are like the couple different tables that you can use. You can also check out like injector duty cycle and stuff on this column here. Estimated duty cycle table. You can see that. All right, so moving on off of the tables, you're going to have a couple boxes up here in the top, and the first one's going to be pretty much just your information on your S300 here. If you click the S300 tab, it's going to bring up like the software version and all that kind of jazz. I don't have this actually hooked up to a Hondata right now. I'm just kind of going over some basics, like I said. So we're going to go on to parameters now. And these are all the different parameters that you can change or modify on Hondata. There's a lot of stuff going on in here, and I figured I would go over some of the basics and the ones that I actually use. Some of these tables you don't actually need to really mess with unless you have like a really radical setup. But for the majority of people that are tuning on Hondata, I mean, I would say any car that's under like 600 horsepower, you're only going to adjust certain tables. And if you have like a dual injector setup or something crazy, something radical, you can do more with a lot of these other tables. But I'm just going to go over some of the basics on the parameters quick to show you guys what they all are and what you can do with all the different parameters. So this first table here is analog inputs, and these are pretty much, when you buy a S300, it comes with like a little wiring harness that you can plug into the top, and it gives you 8 different outputs that you can use. So you can actually use any of these and use this for any different thing. So I mean, if you want to use like a different air temp sensor or a different coolant temp sensor or anything like that, you can use any of these inputs here and set it up that way. Like I said, I don't usually use any of these analog inputs. I don't really need to, because a lot of the factory stuff works good enough for me. So second table here on the parameters is the boost control. The boost control here is for if you have like a 3-port or 4-port boost solenoid wired into the ECU and you have boost by gear components actually soldered into the ECU. If you have all that stuff soldered in and everything wired correctly, you can actually enable this and set up your boost controller with the duty cycle here and all these different tables. I feel like I'm going to make a totally separate video on doing the boost control tables, just because this could be a whole video in itself, and setting it up and setting frequencies and all that kind of stuff. So I feel like I'll go over that in a separate video. But this is a really cool feature, and you can set up boost by gear and boost by RPM or quick spool or anything like that. So super cool table here. The next table here is the boost cut table. This is a very important table that tuners should be using, because if your car ends up running into like a catastrophic overboost condition, this will actually save the engine from exploding. And this pretty much will cut the engine if the boost reaches over a certain PSI of pressure. It has a cold or a hot boost setting, so you can set the cold boost at, I would set this at like 1 pound until it warmed up, because technically I don't even like running boost at all until the motor is warmed up. And then the hot boost here, obviously you can set this at whatever maximum boost your car would ever want to see. So like say on my car, I'd set it at like 20 or 25 pounds, and set that up there. You can do low boost and high boost settings, so that's on a totally different table, but you can set your low boost table at like 15 pounds and your high boost at 25 pounds or whatever. The next table here is closed loop. This is where you would set up your wideband wired into the ECU to set up for those lambda correction tables like I was showing in the beginning of the video. You can either use the stock O2 sensor, which doesn't really work because it's a narrow band sensor and it doesn't really give an accurate air-fuel ratio reading. You can disable it if you have no O2 sensors, which a lot of cars do not have O2 sensors even hooked up. Or you can use the wideband input on like an AEM Uego or whatever like that and set that up that way. I usually run them disabled, and then I just set up the wideband over here on closed loop advanced. This is how I set up my AEM on my car, and yeah. So onto the closed loop advanced table here. This is where you would input your wire for your wideband. So the white wire on the AEM would go to D14 on the Hondata here, and then you would set up these here. So like on an AEM, it's 2.5 to 15 air-fuel ratio here. And that would set up your wideband so it reads properly when you're data logging it, and when you're trying to shoot for these targets up here. You have to set this up. Some widebands will come with a voltage to lambda conversion table, like the AEM actually comes with one, and you can set it up based on what they tell you on the instruction manual of the wideband. Now this is the target lambda table down here. You can set up different targets for different temperatures and different loads. So like if the car is wide open throttle, no boost, you want to shoot for like a 1320, and then obviously coming into boost 12.5 and full boost, mid 11s or whatever. This is just for like a target table. I don't usually use a lot of this stuff. Like I said, I just kind of tune the map, and I record the air fuel ratio and just tune the table according to what the data log is telling me. But some of the stuff on Hondata, you can actually use auto tune, so you can set this up so the car is going to automatically try to target these numbers for air fuel ratio. The only thing I just don't really recommend it because it can have some glitches and it doesn't usually work the smoothest. A lot of the times I can actually tune the car smoother than the Hondata actually can, so sometimes it's better just to tune the map yourself. This is just another input and output table, just like you were to have over here on the analog inputs side. Now the next table we're going into is the flex fuel table. I have not messed with this yet, and I would like to in the future. I feel like this could be another whole separate video on setting up an ethanol content sensor, but you pretty much would just enable it on any of these pins here. So if you use D12 for example, you can set this up and then tune the car for like the highest ethanol content that you can get, tune it, and then you can set this up to correct for any differentiations or any differences in ethanol content. So if you're driving down the road with 85% ethanol one day and then have to put a half a tank of pump gas in and your ethanol content drops to 30%, the Hondata with the sensor can actually compensate for any differences in the fuel, and can pull timing and add or subtract fuel according to whatever ethanol content you have. Like I said, I haven't messed with a lot of this stuff because the ethanol where I go is consistent all year long. Some gas stations will actually pull ethanol content out of the fuel for winter months and add more ethanol content in for summer months, because some vehicles don't like to cold start with a lot of ethanol content in the fuel. But for a lot of other people around my area, like a couple other cities over, their ethanol gas stations are very sporadic. So this would actually be a good thing to have on some of those cars, because one day you could go to the pump and get 70% ethanol, and the next day you could go and get 40. And if you did not have this enabled and the tune was set up for 70% ethanol and you put 40% in it, the tune would get very rich. You could flood the motor out of fuel and drown the oil and spin some bearings. So I mean, this is actually a really good investment for a lot of people that don't have consistent ethanol in their area. But like I said, I'm lucky, and I just watch my wideband to make sure my ethanol hasn't changed. But this would be a really cool thing to do in a future video. So the next table here is the fuel compensation table. This is another table I don't usually play with a whole lot, because a lot of this stuff's already preset on Hondata to be correct and to be where you want it to be. They have a pretty good handle on this stuff already without even messing with it out of the box. Sometimes I'll zero out some of these because I'll notice, like, if it's a super hot summer day, I might see a little bit of differentiation, but like I said, they have a pretty good handle on it for intake air temperature, so I usually don't mess with the intake air temp stuff. Now you can also go down here and adjust for water temperature correction. So if the car is really cold, like say it's 32 degrees out like it is here in Wisconsin right now, the car automatically will add 25% fuel in on when the car is cold, and then slowly taper it back out until it gets to like 168. I usually zero it once it gets to like 168 on all these, just because I feel like anything over 160 is not going to really affect fueling in my personal experience. So I usually zero them out after like 168 and above. But that's pretty much what all this is down here on the fuel compensation. It's just going to add fuel in when the car is colder, and then take fuel out and have it run basically just on the fuel map once it hits a certain temperature, which in this case I like it to switch over to the fuel map around 168. Next table here is the fuel injector table. This is where you would change your injector size. So say if you had a set of my decap fuel injectors that I sell on the website, I usually just tell people to punch in 1000 cc on the current injector size, and then you can choose one of the presets here. I usually just use the Detchworks 1000 cc dead times, and they work pretty good. They're not like 100% perfect. I actually have a set that Brent used, a set of dead times that Brent from PFI used, and he actually gave me his dead times too, so I might be trying those ones out to see how much difference it makes. Some injectors are really picky with dead times, and some injectors, like these flex fuel ones, aren't that picky, so the pre-selected ones usually work pretty good. Now below all this injector voltage compensation, we have a thing for staged injection. I usually don't mess with this. Like I said, I don't really need it. If you max out a set of 4 2200s, you're making some pretty good power, and I don't know if you would, I don't think I'd ever go bigger than that, so I've never really messed with it. But you can pretty much run an 8 injector setup, so you can have 4 injectors on the top of the manifold and 4 injectors on the bottom of the manifold, and stage it in. So this will be the second set of injectors that'll kick in once the car hits a certain load. So I would set this at like probably 250 kPa after 20 pounds of boost or whatever the second set of injectors run until 40 pounds of boost or whatever you are running. But that's pretty much what that is. Like I said, I've never really messed with it because I've never needed it. Next table here is fuel trim. So this is the overall fuel trim. So if your injector size is a little bit off or something like that, you can actually change the overall fuel trim and add in or subtract, 10, 20, 50%, whatever it is. I don't usually ever mess with this. If your injector size is off, I usually just set the injector size to where it's happy, and that usually works better for me instead of messing with this overall fuel trim here. The one below it is cranking fuel trim. This one is actually pretty common that I end up using because on a big injector car, sometimes they don't like to cold start, or they don't like to crank, or they have a problem starting up because they either have too much fuel in when the motor's cranking, or they have not enough fuel when the engine's cranking. So you can either subtract 20 or 30% from this to help the car start up. That's pretty much what this cranking fuel trim table is right here. Throttle tip-in is going to be, this table here is going to be for when you're gear transitioning and when you're, slamming gears and slamming the gas on and off really good. I usually like to relate this to an accelerator pump on a carburetor. It's kind of the same concept. If the car wants like an additional splash of fuel when you smash the gas down to the floor, you can add it in here or subtract it if it's too much fuel when you smash the gas really hard to the floor. Usually if the fuel map itself is tuned good and you don't have any hiccups on the fuel map, you don't usually have to mess with the throttle tip-in at all. The only time that you really kind of have to mess with it is if it's a really radical setup, like ITBs or something like that. Then you may have to mess with this, but I've never had to in the past. Like I said, as long as the map itself is tuned good, you don't usually have to mess with the throttle tip-in, from my experience. Like I said, this is all just my experience and me just talking about this stuff because, a lot of people have never messed with it, so I feel like I could maybe show you guys. and help some people out. Now below the throttle tip-in, we're going to have cylinder fuel trim. This is a table where you can actually take each individual cylinder and add or subtract fuel from those cylinders. So like on a Honda, say this number 2 and 3 cylinders actually run hotter than the 1 and 4 cylinders. I don't know why, but the center 2 cylinders run a little bit hotter on Hondas. And if you wanted to play it safe, you could add in 5% on the cylinder 2 and 3 here. But I don't usually mess with it. I usually just leave them zeroed and don't usually have issues. So. But that is cool that you can adjust that stuff on Hondata as well. And this is just another post-fuel startup adjustment. So like if you're having cranking issues or starting issues, you can go onto these tables here and play with some of the numbers until the car starts up and runs good. Next table here is full throttle shift. The full throttle shift table I don't usually use either, but you can set it up with a clutch switch if you still have the clutch switch. So if you have to push the clutch in to start the car, you still have the clutch switch. And you can set this up so the shift limiter, this would pretty much just pull power when you push the clutch in, so you can keep your foot to the floor and not have to lift off the gas, because once the clutch is pushed in, it's going to automatically pull power out of the engine. So you have an easier gear transition and you don't, break transmissions as easily. I don't usually mess with it, but I may mess with it on this car just to kind of show you guys how to use it. You can also use a strain gauge on here, which is super cool. A strain gauge is where it notices when you pull on the shifter, it'll cut power instead of, pushing the clutch in. Some guys literally won't even touch the clutch and they'll just freaking bang them, which is super cool. But I don't have a strain gauge and I don't plan on using one in the future. Maybe if I go super crazy on a build, I'll grab a strain gauge of some sort from like Real Street Performance. I know they sell them, but yeah, you can use the strain gauge on here. Like I said, I've never messed with any of this stuff, so but you do have these options on Hondata. The next table is gear compensation. So if your car is running richer in 5th gear or 4th gear or 3rd gear, you can adjust it here. I don't usually have issues with any of this stuff. I don't touch this table usually, other than just setting the gear ratio. So like my car has a GSR transmission, so we would select that, and yeah, that's all I would really do. I wouldn't touch any of this other stuff. Like I said, you don't really need to a lot of the times, so at least in my experience. This is the idle table. This is pretty simple. You can just set your minimum idle speed, so the idle air control valve will actually make sure the car doesn't go below 850 RPM. From my experience, the idle air control valve is a little bit lazy, so if your throttle stop on your throttle body set a little bit too low, the RPM can actually dip below that 850, and then it'll come back and try to catch itself. That's usually because the throttle stop is not adjusted properly. So what I usually do is I turn this off to set the idle, and then I set it with the throttle stop, and then I'll set this back to the normal spot or wherever the car likes to run smooth. I'll play with this guy, the duty cycle and the idle air control valve, just until the car runs smooth and doesn't idle surge. But like I said, the main thing I do is I turn this freaking thing off and then set the idle with the throttle stop on the throttle body versus playing with this. I know some people just play with this to adjust the idle, and that's not technically the right way to do it. This is kind of just a way to quick and dirty get your idle set. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the idle table. It's pretty simple stuff. Now this is the ignition compensation table. This is going to be the same exact thing as the fuel compensation table, except with ignition. So if your ignition or if your intake air temperature gets above like 140 degrees, it'll start pulling ignition out of it because hot air tends to detonate easier, and you would have to pull ignition timing out if your intake air temperatures got, say above 140 degrees. So like I said, I don't usually touch this stuff. It's already set up pretty good out of the box, where you don't really have to mess with it at all. Same thing with the water temp. It's going to add ignition in when it's cold and then pull ignition as it warms up. If your car is overheating, it's going to pull timing, etc. Next table is the launch control table. So this you can set up so it's always on, and it'll go off the vehicle speed sensor. So if your car is below 6 miles an hour, it's going to activate the launch control, and you can set this at, say 6,500 RPM. And then you can activate the two-step along with it. So the two-step or the anti-lag, not the two-step, but the anti-lag where you get the flames and boost generating and all that kind of stuff is right below the launch limiter here under fuel and ignition settings. And I usually set this up around 200 to 300 RPM before the actual limiter. And you can play with this and say add 50% of fuel and pull 30 degrees of timing. This is usually kind of a good base to start with to see what the car likes and how fast you can get it to build boost. Because that's really the goal with this, is you want the car to be able to build boost on the launch control, and that's why you have to add fuel in and pull ignition out. So the explosion happens at the completely wrong time, and the car actually builds a load to build boost. So under that, we're going to have a burnout rev limiter. This is actually pretty cool too. You can actually set this up to be always on, or you can set it up to be, with your brake switch. So if your e-brake is pulled when you're doing a burnout, your rev limiter is going to be lower than what the actual rev limiter is. So say my rev limiter is at 8200 and I'm in the burnout box doing a burnout, and I just want to hold it to the floor to keep the tires spinning good, and I don't really want to be revving the engine very high. You can actually set this to be lower, say 7,000 RPM instead of 8,200. So the next table here is the map sensor. This is where you would adjust for a replacement. So say if you got like a GM 3 bar or Omni 4 bar or something like that, you can click the map sensor here, or you can just set up your offset and scalar numbers here. But most of the time they have most of the map sensors that are common already on here. Even some of like the eBay 3 bars, you can just play with some of these preset settings and make sure that everything matches up. So I think my car actually has a eBay 3 bar map sensor on it, and this MSD 3 bar actually works good, and it actually matches up exactly what the boost gauge is telling me. So that's one way to check. You can actually just go under display and check what the map sensor reading is on the computer, and then try to match it to, like, say your boost gauge or something like that to make sure that it's accurate. And in my case, it is. So the next table here is the miscellaneous table. This is where you would disable some sensors. Say like my car, I don't have a knock sensor, so I would disable this. And that's really all I would disable. You can disable a bunch of stuff on here that you shouldn't need to. Usually if the car is set up properly and everything is working, a lot of the stuff you won't even need to disable unless you don't have a spot on your motor for a knock sensor. Then you would obviously delete it there. You can set up your speed sensor here. So like if you have a different size tire on it, you can set up like a 20% correction or 10% correction. So the speedo reads accurate to what the car is actually doing. So if I have like a really big 26-inch tire on the car, I can change this number to have the speedo read correctly. You can also change the fuel pump priming time here. You can set up, so like if you have like a super big fuel line on the car, like a -10 or a -8 feed line, you can set up the priming time of the fuel pump to be longer, so it fills up the bigger fuel line. But like I said, most cars you don't even really need to touch a lot of this stuff. 2 seconds is plenty for the priming, and the speed sensor correction I don't usually mess with because this doesn't bother me that much. These are more auxiliary tables, inputs and outputs for like nitrous. You can actually set this up so if you have a arming switch for your nitrous, say if it's on a TPS or a switch or a button or anything like that, you can wire this into the ECU, and once you hit that button, it'll actually change the amount of fuel and the amount of ignition that's actually in the tune. So that's another cool feature on Hondata, is you can have pretty much a separate table here for your nitrous or whatever. So whenever you're not hitting the nitrous button, it's going to be on your normal tune-up, and then whenever you are hitting the nitrous, it'll switch over to this guy. This is just a notes table, so if you want to type in what you've done to the tune, you can do it on this table here. Onboard data logging, this is going to be pretty much, you can set up like a switch in your car to start a log instead of having the laptop in the car. I think that's what this is. I don't usually mess with it because I just go on the frickin' data log here and I just hit record when I'm data logging, so I don't usually mess with a lot of this stuff, like I said. Next table here is a protection table. This is actually super cool because you can set up, so if your wideband's wired into the ECU, you can actually set this up so like say you don't want your car to run leaner than like a 12-0 air fuel ratio. above 10 pounds of boost. You don't want it to run above a 12-0 air-fuel ratio above 10 pounds of boost. You can set this up, and if it notices over a 12-0 air-fuel ratio above 10 pounds of boost, it'll cut power to the engine and end up saving your engine and prevent you from melting a piston probably. So that's a super cool thing that you can play with on Hondata as well. You can set this up whatever way you want, but yeah, so like on my car I have it set up so if it goes over a 12.5 above 12 pounds of boost, or above 10 pounds of boost, it'll cut the engine power. You can do the same thing for like overheating. So like if it gets above 212 degrees, it'll shut the car off. You can override the fan. So like the cooling fan here, you can set up so it comes on at 180 instead of 199, or you can set it up to so it only comes on at 210, etc. And then turn it off as the car gets accelerating. So once the car is above 31 miles an hour, it's going to turn the cooling fan off, because you don't need a cooling fan on when you're driving down the road usually. That's it for the protection table. We'll move on to the rev limiter table. This is pretty simple. I have mine set up at 8200 in every gear currently, so I would just have to go through and change these all to 8200 and set that up for all these here. Now some guys like to run a higher rev limiter in fourth gear, especially if they're running out of running out of ground on the drag strip. So like my car, I know will do 135 miles an hour, and it'll be damn near hitting the rev limiter at the quarter mile at 135 miles an hour. But if, say, I put more power in it and I hit the limiter before I cross the finish line, I would probably raise this to like 8,700 in fourth, just to get it to have some more room to mile an hour up top. You can also do it by speed. So like I just don't usually mess with this. I just set it up based off of what gear I'm in or whatever. You can also set up the activation RPM to set in the middle, late, or early. So this will activate the power reduction sooner or later. I don't usually like to have a lot of power reduction in the rev limiter, because if you have a lot of power reduction in it, it's going to fall on its face when it hits the rev limiter. You can have that set up all the way so it hits a brick wall when it hits the rev limiter, or you can have it virtually no power reduction at all, so it just sits there and goes and the car's still accelerating while on the rev limiter, which is how I prefer it. And then on the bottom here you have the rev limiter type. I always use fuel and ignition just because it sounds badass. If you have just fuel, it's going to be kind of like a buh buh buh, and if you have fuel and ignition, it tends to be a lot faster of a rev limiter, and usually you get fireballs and cool shit. So that's something cool that you can do with Hondata, is you can use an ignition cut as a rev limiter as well. Speed limiter here, pretty self-explanatory stuff. Don't go over 158 miles an hour. Or you can set it at 200 and do whatever. Secondary table switching. This is a table where you can actually set up your second table. So like say if you have a E85 tune and a pump gas tune, you can actually set this up on a switch, so it'll switch the tune to a different fuel map and ignition map. I don't usually mess with it. I just run my shit on E85 all the time. But you can set all this stuff up, which is pretty cool. Security, this is a table I also don't mess with, but you can set up on this table where you can set up where you have to like pump the gas 10 times for the car to start up, or pump it 5 times, or hold it at half throttle to start the car or whatever. So like if your neighborhood is a bad neighborhood and you have a lot of theft, this may be something you want to look into and changing these settings. But honestly, this is more of a pain in the ass to me, because I'll forget what I set it at and end up forgetting how to start my car. Like, oh fuck, I gotta pump the gas 3 times, and I gotta hit the brake pedal twice, and then I gotta hold it at half throttle, and then it'll start. That's just kind of what these are here. Like I said, I don't usually mess with it. This is the shift light table. This is pretty simple. This will just flash the check engine light whenever you hit a certain RPM. So like say my rev limiter is at 8200, I would set the shift light at like say 7800. So whenever I see the shift light, it'll be right before the rev limiter hits, and this would probably avoid me from hitting the rev limiter. If I see that check engine light in the corner of my eye, I'd be like, hey, time to fucking shift, Hunter. So I would probably set these at 7800. or just leave it off. It doesn't matter either way. It's just a cool feature that you can use. This is a traction control table. This is actually a really cool thing on Hondata as well. You can actually set this up with a rear wheel speed sensor. So you could put a speed sensor on the back tire, and it'll take the input from the speed sensor off the transmission and the input from the rear wheel speed sensor, and will actually combine the two. So if you have a higher wheel speed in the front than the back, it'll actually pull power out of the tune to help with traction control. So if you have wheel speed, it'll pull power just enough to keep the car, the two speed sensors, in line with each other, and keep the car from wheel spinning. I don't usually mess with it, but it is a cool feature that you can use. This is a TPS table. You can use these for, you can scale your TPS or calibrate it on these and set up your fuel cutoff. So like if your throttle is below 2%, it'll turn all the fuel injectors off because you're just coasting down the road. And this is also for like tip in and stuff like that. The tip in will kick in at a certain throttle percentage or whatever. But like I said, I don't usually mess with a lot of this stuff because it's already preset for you. But if you have a really radical setup, there's a lot of stuff you can adjust and play with. This is just another throttle position table that I don't mess with at all. Like I said, you can play with a lot of this stuff and go on. You can sit on here for days and just play around. Last but not least, this is the VTEC parameter table. This is where you would enable or disable VTEC, and you can set your VTEC point. Say like my car is at 5,000, I think. I always usually set the upper and lower boundaries the same, and I don't have any issues. So VTEC will kick in at 5,000 RPM. And then you can set this up so like VTEC won't hit until you're dedicated to a pole. So like if you're just cruising down the highway at 30% throttle, it's not going to be in and out of VTEC if your car has like a B16 transmission that's really short geared and you're sitting at 5,500 on the highway doing 80. It's not actually going to cross into VTEC until the throttle meets this requirement here, 50%. And it's also not going to hit VTEC until the temperature gets over 153 degrees. And one last cool thing here too is when you have an S300, you can actually use like a P06 or a P05 or a P75 ECU that's non-VTEC and still have a VTEC motor and an output to control VTEC. You would just have to use any of these guys here to activate VTEC instead of the A4 where the standard VTEC wire would go on an OBD1 computer. You would just have to use like any of these outputs here instead. Which is cool because that saves you money on an ECU if you don't have one. And you only have like a P06 or something, you can still run your VTEC motor with your P06. So yeah, that's kind of some basics here with Hondata and going over some of the parameters. I'm going to go over like data logging and stuff in a separate video, so I may do that. You guys can look forward to that and how to hook up your data logger and how to start logging with Hondata. So I may do another video on that as well, but I figured I'd go over some basics and show you guys around Hondata, so maybe you guys can get your feet wet yourself. So always remember to like, comment, and subscribe to my channel, especially if you liked this video. If it was helpful at all, please hit the like button. If you guys want to see more videos like this, please hit the like button, and I will be more inclined to make more. If you guys don't like seeing these kind of videos, let me know. Up to you. You guys are the determiner of what you want to see here on the channel, so I figured I would just do this because I had a lot of questions on how to use Hondata and tuning with Hondata. So this is just going to be one of those basic kind of videos that shows you the software and shows you some of the different parameters that you can adjust on Hondata. So yeah, anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, let me know. So we will see you in another video, I guess. Thanks for watching.